The sword didn't fit him. That was the first thing anyone noticed about Callum Ashvale. Not his youth. Not the travel-worn pack strapped to his shoulders. Not even the mud still caked along the hem of his cloak from 3 days of walking through the Thornfen marshes. It was the sword. A short blade, clearly made for someone broader. Someone whose hand had grown into the leather-wrapped hilt through years of grip and sweat and purpose. On Callum, it hung at an angle, the scabbard tip nearly dragging the ground when he forgot to hold it steady. He forgot often. The village of Galdenmere was modest even by the standards of the Midreach. A cluster of stone-walled buildings wedged between a slow-moving river and a hillside terraced with barley. Smoke rose from chimneys in lazy spirals. A blacksmith's hammer rang out in steady rhythm. Children ran between the market stalls, and none of them paid the 20-year-old traveler much attention. He was, in every observable way, unremarkable. Callum stopped at the well in the village square, set down his pack with a grunt, and stretched his back with the groan of someone who had been walking far longer than his body had agreed to. He cupped water in his hands, drank, and looked around with the careful, wide-eyed attention of someone cataloging a new place for the first time, because for him, every place still was. He had grown up in Westerlo, a farming settlement so small it didn't appear on most maps. His father grew wheat. His mother kept bees. His older sisters had married and stayed. Callum had done none of those things because 3 months ago, a wandering merchant had passed through Westerlo with stories that had lodged themselves in Callum's chest like splinters. Stories of ruins that hummed with old magic, of cities, where every race walked the same streets, of a world so much larger than barley fields and beehives that it seemed impossible the same sky covered all of it. He had left with his father's spare sword, his mother's blessing, and almost no idea what he was doing. The sword was the problem. It was a problem that announced itself loudly every time Callum tried to draw it, which he had done exactly twice, once to frighten off a dog that had seemed threatening, and once by accident when the scabbard catch had misfired, and the blade had clattered into the mud at his feet. He had looked around quickly both times to make sure no one had seen. Someone usually had. He was sitting on the edge of the well, eating the last of a travel biscuit and contemplating whether he should try the inn or sleep under the old oak at the edge of town, when the door to that very inn swung open, and a woman walked out. She wasn't large. That was the first thing that surprised him because everything about her presence suggested she should be. She stood just above average height, lean and deliberate in the way she moved, like each step had been decided a half-second before she took it. Her hair was dark and shot through with gray at the temples, cut practically short. One arm bore a long, pale scar that ran from elbow to wrist, old, well-heeled, earned. A traveler's sword hung at her hip, and unlike Callum's, it sat exactly where it was supposed to. She glanced at him once, the way experienced travelers assess strangers, quick, complete, and without malice. Then she looked away and began checking the straps on a pack she had set down by the inn's front step. Callum told himself not to stare. He stared anyway. Her name, he would learn shortly, was Maren Voss. She was 41 years old, had served 8 years as a contract soldier in the Iron Gate Wars, 6 years as a caravan guard along the eastern trade roads, and had since spent the better part of a decade doing what she described, when pressed, as whatever needs doing. She did not offer this information freely. She had said perhaps 14 words to him in the 10 minutes since he had, through a combination of nervous politeness and genuine curiosity, asked whether she knew the road north toward the Ashvale reaches. She had told him it was dangerous, that the reaches were worse this season due to a collapsed garrison outpost that had left a stretch of road unpatrolled, and that if he planned to travel it, he should do so as someone who knew what they were doing. Do you? Callum had asked. Maren had looked at him for a long moment, then at the sword hanging sideways from his belt. Yes, she'd said. And then, with something that might have been either mercy or dark amusement, you're going to get yourself killed. I know. Callum had admitted. That's why I'm hoping to find someone to travel with. She had gone quiet after that, finished checking her pack, and said nothing for long enough that Callum assumed the conversation was over. He was calculating whether it would be awkward to simply walk away when she sighed, a short, resigned exhale, and said, I'm heading north. You can keep up, or you can fall behind, but I'm not slowing down. He had nearly knocked his own pack into the well, scrambling to follow her. They left Galdenmere as the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the barley terraces. moving north along a road that narrowed quickly once the village dropped behind the first hill. The land here was old, the kind of old that announced itself in the texture of the stones, in the way roots had buckled the road in great slow heaves, in the moss-covered standing stones that appeared at irregular intervals along the tree line, carved with symbols Callum didn't recognize. "What are those?" he asked, nodding toward one of the stones. "Waymarkers," Maren said, without slowing. "Old halfling trail markers. This road follows a path that was here long before anyone thought to pave it." Callum looked at the stone as they passed, trying to imagine the small, sure-footed travelers who had placed it there, perhaps centuries ago. He had a habit of doing that, of trying to populate the past with people, to make history feel inhabited rather than empty. It was a trait that had made him a poor farmer and an incessant question-asker. "Have you been to the Ashvale Reaches before?" he asked. "Several times." "What's there?" "Trouble, mostly." A pause. "And a town called Duskrow, if we're lucky enough to reach it." Callum absorbed that. The word lucky was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. By the time they stopped for the evening, Maren choosing a campsite with the kind of practiced efficiency that made Callum aware of how much he didn't know about choosing campsites. The sun had gone, and the first stars were pressing through the darkening sky. He built the fire badly, and she rebuilt it without comment, rearranging the wood in a way he couldn't quite follow, but which produced a steadier flame. "Your grip is wrong," she said, not looking up. Callum, who had not been aware he was doing anything with his grip, looked down. He was holding a stick he'd been using to poke the fire. "On the stick?" "On everything." She finally looked at him. "That sword. You hold it like it's going to bite you." "It might," he said honestly. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "Tomorrow, before we move, you'll practice drawing it. Slowly. Until it feels like part of your arm and not a piece of furniture you're apologizing to." Callum nodded, and the fire crackled between them, and the forest beyond their small circle of light was full of the quiet, ancient sound of things that had been there long before either of them and would be there long after. He did not sleep well, but for the first time since leaving Westerlo, he felt like he might be in exactly the right place. Maren Voss did not believe in explanation. This was something Callum came to understand over the first 4 days of travel, during which she offered exactly 0 formal lessons, no theory, and no encouragement beyond the occasional curt again. What she did instead was do things. And she did them in plain sight, and she trusted that if he was paying attention, he would learn. She was, in this way, profoundly unlike every teacher Callum had ever encountered, all of whom had explained at length and demonstrated rarely. He found himself watching her with the focused attention of someone trying to read a language they half recognized, catching enough to follow, but missing too much to be confident. The mornings had a shape now. They rose before the light turned gold, while the sky was still that deep, pre-dawn blue that felt like held breath. Callum made the fire, each day slightly better, slightly less supervised, while Maren ran through a series of stretches and movements that were not quite exercises and not quite something else. When the water was hot, they drank 8, and then she made him draw the sword. Slowly at first. Just the motion of it, pull, clear, hold. Not a fighting stance, just a draw. He did it wrong in every possible way. Too fast, too slow, the wrong grip, the wrong angle. She didn't correct him verbally. She stood beside him and did it herself, in slow motion, and he watched her wrist, her elbow, the way her shoulder stayed loose instead of rising with effort. He copied her. He got it wrong. He tried again. On the 3rd morning, he drew the blade cleanly for the first time, smooth, controlled, the steel catching the early light, and looked up to find her watching him with a look that was not quite approval, but was its close cousin. "Again," she said. He did it 15 more times. They were 2 days into the Ashvale Reaches by then, and the landscape had shifted from the gentle farmland hills into something rawer, scrub heath and dark-trunked trees. Peat bogs hidden beneath deceptively solid-looking ground, the smell of iron-rich water that ran in thin rivulets between hummocks of pale grass. It was a landscape that required attention. Callum, who had a tendency to look up at things rather than down at where he was stepping, had been rescued from 3 separate near-bog plunges by Maren's quiet, hand on his arm, steering him right without commentary. "How do you know where the solid ground is?" he asked on the 2nd morning in the Reaches. "Color," she said. "Texture. The way things grow. Bright green usually means water beneath. The darker heath grass holds. Callum looked down. He tried to see what she was seeing, the subtle difference between a step that would hold and a step that would swallow his boot to the ankle. It was not obvious. But for the rest of the day he practiced looking, and by evening he had stopped needing to be steered. Small victories. The evenings were the most revealing. Maren was not a talker by nature, but the dark and the fire and the particular quality of silence that settles over wild country seemed to loosen something in her. Not dramatically. She didn't tell grand stories or confess old wounds. But she answered questions, which was something. Callum asked them carefully. He had discovered early that asking too many, too fast, made her close up like a book pressed shut. So he rationed them, one at a time, and let the space between her answer and his next question stay quiet. On the fourth evening, he asked about the scar on her arm. She looked at it with the expression people use when examining something so familiar it has nearly stopped existing. Irongate, she said. Third campaign. A soldier on our own side. Friendly accident, they called it. A pause. He panicked in a choke point. It happens. Were you angry? Furious, she said simply. And then not. He was 18, terrified. Panicking is how people get killed, but it's also just how people are when they're terrified and young and no one's properly prepared them for it. She looked at Callum then, a look that was calm and measuring and without cruelty. That's what I was thinking about when I agreed to let you travel with me. Callum sat with that for a moment. That I might panic. That you haven't been prepared. Different thing. She poked the fire once. Panic comes from not knowing what to do next. You learn enough of that. The panic shrinks. He thought about this for a long time after she turned in for the night. On the fifth day, they met the merchant. He was a gnome, small, compact. Enormously cheerful in the way some gnomes maintained as a kind of philosophical position rather than a mood. His name was Birtwick Knowles, and he had an overly laden cart, a donkey of advanced years and dubious temper, and a tale of woe that he delivered with great theatrical energy. He had been heading to Duskrow, had lost a wheel axle in a rut, and had been waiting, he claimed, for someone competent to come along for almost a full day. Maren helped him with the axle with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen this problem before. Callum assisted, mostly by handing her tools when she pointed at them, and afterward Birtwick fed them from a remarkable surplus of provisions in his cart. Cured meats, hard cheese, something dense and spiced that he called hearthbread, and which was the best thing Callum had eaten in weeks. Over the meal Birtwick talked. He had a gift for it, the rolling, layered speech of someone who traveled alone often and saved up conversation for the moments it was available. He told them about Duskrow, which was apparently a market town that had grown up around a ford in the Ashford River, and which he visited twice a year. He told them about the garrison outpost that had collapsed, not in the military sense, he clarified, but literally. An old wooden structure, poorly maintained, rotted through and caved in after a heavy spring snowfall, leaving the northern road unguarded. And then he told them about the Holloway. It's the shortcut everyone knows about and no one uses, he said, helping himself to more hearthbread. Cuts 2 days off the Duskrow route, runs through the old Ashfin elven pathways, underground, mostly. Very old. Very dry, which is a blessing in this country. He paused. Apparently to build tension, though his expression suggested it was also because he was chewing. The reason people don't use it is that something moved in about a year ago. Something that's been discouraging travelers. No one quite agrees on what. Something magic? Callum asked, leaning forward. Birtwick tilted a hand side to side. Old magic, maybe. The elves who built those paths were a northern clan, Ashfin-born. And they worked a kind of attunement magic, very subtle, more feeling than force. The paths were meant to know the people who walked them. He shrugged. When the last of that line left the reaches, the paths started forgetting. Forgotten magic is unpredictable magic. Maren had been quiet throughout this, but Callum noticed she was paying close attention. How old are the paths? She asked. At least 4 centuries. And maybe more. She said nothing. But later, when Birtwick had climbed into his cart to sleep and the fire was low, she looked at Callum across the coals with an expression he was learning to read, something weighing itself. The Holloway would save time, he said carefully. It would. You're thinking about it. I'm thinking about a lot of things. She was quiet for a moment. What do you know about attunement magic? Callum thought. His knowledge of magic was theoretical and unreliable, gathered from stories and the one traveling scholar who had come through Westhello when he was 12. It responds to people, he said slowly. Not commands, presence, emotion almost. Maren looked at him with what might have been mild surprise. That's essentially correct. She stood, brushing off her knees. Get some sleep. We'll decide in the morning. He lay awake a while longer, listening to the wind move through the heath grass and thinking about paths that could know you, and what it might mean to walk somewhere that was learning your name. They took the hollow way. The entrance was not marked on any map Callum had seen, a narrow cleft between two old elven waystone pillars, half buried in creeping heather, with an archway carved from living rock that had been shaped rather than cut, the edges flowing in curves no chisel would naturally produce. The attunement stonework of the Ashvale elves, Maren had explained, was grown as much as built, a magic called verdant shaping that convinced stone to flow the way water did, slowly over years. The result was architecture that felt organic, like the bones of something rather than the construction of it. Inside, the passage widened immediately. The walls were pale gray stone and they glowed, not brightly, but sufficiently. A faint bioluminescent quality baked into the rock itself by centuries of the elves' light-working magic. The floor was smooth underfoot, the air cool and carrying the faint mineral sweetness of deep stone. It was, in spite of everything, beautiful, Callum said so. Don't let that distract you, Maren said, but there was no sharpness in it. For the first hour, nothing troubled them. The holloway branched occasionally, and at each branch, Maren paused, studying the walls. The way the light was slightly different in each direction. Callum didn't ask how she knew which way. He watched instead, and gradually he began to see what she was seeing. The right passages had a warmer quality to the glow, the light slightly amber where it was purely silver in the wrong branches. Attunements, still working, still guiding in the automatic way of old magic that no longer needed attention to function. Then, at the second hour, the light changed. It was subtle at first, a slight cooling of the amber, the warmth bleeding out of it in a way that felt less like a physical change and more like a mood. The air shifted not in temperature but in quality. Callum noticed it in his sternum first, a pressure, gentle but persistent, like the moment before a storm. Maren had already stopped walking. She stood very still in the passage, one hand not quite at her sword hilt, close but not touching, listening. Then the shape appeared at the far end of the passage. It was not what Callum had expected. He had been imagining something monstrous, a creature, a predator. What he saw instead was a figure, and the figure was made of light. Not the warm amber silver of the passage walls, but something older and more specific, pale blue-white, shaped vaguely like a tall elven form, indistinct at the edges, the face a suggestion of features rather than features themselves. It didn't move. It stood and it regarded them, and the pressure in Callum's chest deepened. Don't speak, Maren said quietly. And don't move your hand toward your weapon. Callum's hand had been moving toward his weapon. He stopped it. For what felt like a very long time, the figure stood and the two of them stood, and nothing happened. Callum thought about what Birtwick had said, about paths that knew the people who walked them, about forgotten magic that had grown unpredictable. He thought about attunement and presence, and what it might mean to be read by something old. He thought, with peculiar clarity, about standing in Westhello, watching the merchant's cart disappear over the hill. The figure took a step forward. Maren said very quietly, "What are you feeling right now?" "Scared," Callum whispered. "But also," he searched for the word, "curious. I want to know what it is. Hold on to that." The curiosity. He looked at her. Why? Because attunement magic reads emotional truth. Fear looks like threat. Curiosity looks like she paused. Like openness. Like an unlocked door. Callum looked back at the figure. He consciously let the fear sit where it was, not pushing it away, not pretending it wasn't there, and reached for the part of him that genuinely, persistently wanted to understand the shape of things. The part that had always made him a terrible farmer and an intractable wanderer. The figure's light shifted. It went from blue-white to something warmer, the amber quality of the passage walls bleeding into it. Not dramatically, not like a transformation in a story. Just a slow, tidal change like a face relaxing out of a frown. and then it spoke. Not in words. Callum heard no language, no sound. But something moved through the air, or through him. A transmission of meaning that bypassed his ears and arrived, fully formed somewhere behind his sternum. Who passes through the old way? Maren said, softly but not to Callum. Travelers. Nothing more. The figure was still watching Callum. He understood in the strange non-verbal way that attunement seemed to communicate. That her answer was noted, was filed, but was not the thing being assessed. It was waiting for him. He found, in that moment, that he didn't know how to be anything except honest. He was still too new at this for performance. A farmer who left, he thought, as clearly as he could manage. Who doesn't know what he's doing yet but is trying to learn. The light changed again. This time it moved out of the figure and into the walls around them. The whole passage briefly filling with something gold and resonant, a warmth that Callum felt not in his skin but somewhere deeper, and which lasted only a few seconds, before fading back to the passage's normal soft light. The figure was gone. Callum let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like minutes. His hands were shaking. He looked at them with vague surprise, as though his body had been doing things without informing him. What was that? He finally asked. A guardian, Maren said. She was checking the passage ahead, methodical and unhurried, as though they had merely paused for water. A remnant, technically. The attunement magic of the Ashvale elves could leave impressions of intent in the stonework, concentrated points of purpose. Over centuries, without anyone to maintain them, they accumulate presence. They start to be something, but it passed us. It passed you. She glanced back at him. I've walked passages like this before. I know how to seem unthreatening. You did something different. A pause. You were actually unthreatening, genuinely open. It recognized the difference. Callum thought about this as they walked, the passage stretching ahead in its quiet amber glow. What would it have done if it hadn't passed us? Disorientation, mostly. Attunement-based guardians don't usually harm, they confuse. Turn you around. Make you walk in circles until you give up and go back a beat. Though after 4 centuries with no one to recalibrate, I wasn't certain of that. You weren't certain and you still brought us in here? I was more certain than I was uncertain. She glanced at him. Also, you needed to be tested. Callum stopped walking. She stopped as well, a few paces ahead, and turned to look at him. You planned this, he said. Not angry, more the tone of someone recalibrating their understanding. You knew about the Guardian, I suspected. Birtwick's description was consistent with a remnant guardian rather than a dangerous creature. The discouraging traveler's detail that matched confused wandering, not injury. She held his gaze steadily. I thought the passage was probably safe. I also thought it would show you something that sparring practice and firebuilding couldn't. What? That how you face something unknown matters more than whether you're armed. She turned back to the path. Come on. We've got another 3 hours of tunnel, and there may be more junctions. He stood a moment longer, turning over what she had said. Something was shifting in him, not a sudden revelation, but something quieter, more incremental. The kind of change that would take weeks to fully understand. He followed her. And behind them, deep in the walls, the attunement magic of the Ashvale elves glowed a little warmer than it had in years. Duskrow announced itself first as sound. The hollow way ended where it had begun, in an unassuming cleft of stone, this one opening onto a hillside above the Ashvale River ford. Below them, the town spread along both banks in a pleasantly chaotic way. The kind of organic growth that happened when a useful crossing point accumulated services, and services accumulated people, and people eventually stopped thinking of it as temporary. There were permanent stone buildings now, a covered market, a bridge where the ford had been, a mill churning steadily in the river's current. Callum stood at the entrance to the hollow way and listened to it for a moment. The market noise, the hammer of the mill, the river, someone's laughter carrying up the hillside, and felt in a way he couldn't entirely articulate, that he was arriving from somewhere very far away. Maren was already moving down the hillside. They had saved nearly 2 days, exactly as Birtwick had claimed. The gnome himself arrived at the Duskrow Bridge by the following morning, having taken the long road with his cart and donkey, and when he saw them already established at a table outside the Riverside Inn, he did a double take of theatrical quality, and demanded to know how they had gotten there first. Maren told him they had taken the hollow way. Birtwick stared. The haunted one? He said. The guardian protected one, Maren corrected mildly, and went back to her breakfast. Callum spent 3 days in Duskrow, and they were unlike any 3 days he'd known before. The town was genuinely diverse in a way that Westerlo had never been. Halfling traders from the river settlements to the south, a clan of dwarven stoneworkers who were apparently in long negotiation with the local council about reinforcing the bridge, 2 elven herbalists who had set up a stall in the covered market and whose presence was regarded by the older locals with the polite wariness reserved for things that were probably fine but hadn't been confirmed fine quite yet. Maren used the time practically. She traded, resupplied, spoke to 3 different people about road conditions northward. Callum watched the town and practiced. Not just the sword, she had introduced him to a stick technique, simple parries and ripostes, which he drilled against a fence post at the edge of the inn's yard each morning, while she supervised from a chair with her tea. "Better," she said on the second morning. "You're not apologizing to it anymore." "The fence post?" He lowered the stick, breathing hard, the sword, the motion. "You're not bracing against it. You're using it." He considered this. "Is there a difference?" "All the difference." She set down her tea. "People who are afraid of the weapon fight against it as much as their opponent. People who trust it let it do what it's meant to do." She stood. Again, on the second evening, sitting at a table in the inn while rain moved through outside and the common room filled with the pure comfortable noise of strangers temporarily sharing warmth. Callum found himself in conversation with one of the dwarven stoneworkers, a woman named Breck, wide-shouldered and gray-streaked, with the specific patience of someone who worked in centuries rather than years. They talked about the Hollow Way. Callum described the Guardian, the light, the moment of the encounter. Breck listened with the focused attention of someone to whom old magic was a practical reality rather than an abstraction. "The Ashvale elves were long memory builders," Breck said. "The kind who made things to last not just their lifetimes but the idea of their lifetimes. What you walked through, that Guardian reading you, that was the path still doing its job. 4 centuries on." She shook her head with what looked like professional admiration. "Extraordinary. It felt like being seen," Callum said, and was surprised by how easily the words came out. "Like something reading past what I look like and into, I don't know. What I actually am." Breck smiled, a deep, unhurried smile. "Yes," she said. "That's what old magic does when it hasn't forgotten what it's for." He thought about that for a long time. On the morning of the 4th day, the one when they were to leave Duskrow, Maren found him at the fence post again, running through the drill sequence on his own, before she had risen. She stood in the doorway of the inn and watched him for a while without speaking. He drew the sword at the end of the sequence. Slowly, deliberately, the motion clean and controlled and wholly his own, nothing borrowed about it. The blade caught the early light. "It fits you better," she said. He looked up. He hadn't heard her come out. "It's the same sword," he said. "Yes." She crossed the yard. Different hand, they left Duskrow mid-morning, moving north on a road that was cleaner and more traveled than the Ashvale paths had been. The sky was high and pale with early spring, and the country opened up around them. Rolling heath giving way to long views, the Ashvale River somewhere to their east, glinting. Callum walked differently. Not dramatically, not in a way a stranger would have noticed. But his pack sat better, and his hand rested near the sword without making contact. Easy and natural, the way you walk near something you trust. His eyes moved more deliberately over the road ahead. Not anxious, not performing alertness, simply present. Maren noticed. She said nothing, which was its own form of acknowledgement. After an hour of quiet walking, Callum said, "Where are we going?" "Exactly. There's a settlement another 3 days north," Maren said. "Carvenmore. There's work there, a merchant company that's been having trouble with their overland cargo route." "Unusual trouble," she glanced at him. "The kind that might involve old magic. You think that's why you're bringing me?" "I think," she said carefully, "that you have a quality that is rare and genuinely useful. You're honest enough to be read and curious enough to keep walking toward things that would send most people running." A pause. "That's not the same as being safe. You're still going to get hurt before this is finished." "Possibly badly." Callum considered this. "That's a strange way to offer encouragement." "It isn't encouragement. It's preparation." She slowed slightly, enough for him to draw even with her. "Encouragement is when I tell you that last week you were dragging a sword through the mud in Galdenmere, and this week you've walked through an elven guardian passage, helped an overloaded gnome, and made a dwarf stonemason talk about the philosophy of memory work. For 2 hours. She started the philosophy part. You kept it going. The thing that was almost a smile appeared again. You're learning. Not fighting. Learning. She stepped over a root in the road without looking down. That's the difference that matters. Callum walked beside her in the pale spring light. The road stretching out ahead into a country full of old magic and new trouble and all the specific, irreplaceable education of things going wrong at exactly the right time. The sword sat at his hip. It fit. 6 months later, in the town of Millhaven, a traveler at an inn described meeting a young man on the northern road. Early 20s, brown-haired, carried a sword with a confidence that seemed recent but not performed. Asked questions the way some people searched, carefully and with genuine intent to find what they were looking for. The traveler hadn't caught his name. He'd been traveling with a woman, dark-haired, gray at the temples, who spoke rarely but whom the younger man clearly watched the way students watch masters. Not with adoration, but with the focused attention of someone trying to understand something they couldn't yet fully articulate. They had been heading east. That was all the traveler knew. In a small study in the city of Havenreach, an elvish scholar named Theoden was adding a note to a longer document about the Ashvale tunnel network, a report on the reactivation of attunement signatures in the Holloway, which his survey instruments had detected in late winter. The Guardian remnant, dormant for decades, had been responding again, acknowledging travelers, distinguishing between them. Theoden found this remarkable. Such reactivations required contact with an emotional signature the old magic recognized as consonant, aligned, in Old Elvish theory, with the original intent of the builders, which had been, as best he could parse the construction records, something like openness to learning. He didn't know whose signature had woken it. He added a footnote and moved on. And in Westhallow, a letter arrived at the Ashvale farm, the handwriting slightly unsteady in the way of someone writing on a surface that wasn't quite flat, a saddlebag, perhaps, or a pack balanced on a knee. The letter described roads and towns and a gnome with a remarkable cart and a dwarven stonemason who knew more about memory than most people know about their own names. At the end, in slightly larger script, as though the writer had leaned closer to the page, "The sword fits now. I'll explain when I'm back." See, his mother read it twice, then tucked it into the wooden box, where she kept important things, next to the beeswax candles and the marriage certificate and the small, pressed wildflower from a field she hadn't seen in 20 years. Outside, the bees moved through the morning light, unhurried, purposeful, doing what they'd always done. O destino desta historia, esta nas suas mas. Se voca acredita que o heroi não esta sozinho, dic su like. Se voca vaio o que os outros não viram. Escreva sua teoria nas comentários. E se voca precisa saber o que acontece a seguir, inscreva-se. O próximo capítulo vai mudar tudo.